The Australian Curriculum Studies Association would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands and the waterways from where we are all meeting today. We pay our respects to the elders past and present, and we extend our respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. We value the contributions of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to education and their continued support of the teaching and learning of all Australians. We recognise that for thousands of years, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have been the first teachers, and that we are committed to continue our learning alongside them. Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the next in our series of AXA Insights. Now, this podcast for this series is looking at instruction and how we use it to implement the curriculum in the classrooms. Now, many schools do adopt very different approaches to delivery of content in their environment, but we can also be very baffled and struggle with maybe the research or evidence that sits behind that. We know there are lots of commercial products out there that promise results, and they not only give us the content to deliver, but also how we're supposed to deliver it. Now, today we speak to Professor Julianne Moss and learn more about how that approach to the integration of the curriculum can go into our practice. So, good morning, Julianne.
Good morning, Anna.
Professor Julianne Moss is the Director for Research for Educational Impact at Deakin University. Now, her research interests include curriculum theory and change, practitioner inquiry, and teacher education. And she has extensive knowledge in the areas of social justice, pedagogy and curriculum, and qualitative research and student diversity. So thrilled to have you with us here today, Julianne. And we'll head straight into the first question because, I love the fact we're talking to you from Hobart today, because you have worked and taught across the vastness of Australia, from that experience in the top end in the NT, right down across the waters to where you are today. Now, our country is vast, but even within each state and territory, it's very large. And whilst we may have a CARA, which sits above it as the kind of the curriculum, we know that within each state and territory, their adaptation of the curriculum is very different according to context. Now, what are some of the factors that you may have seen that require different, maybe pedagogical approaches required in how the curriculum can be enacted?
Yeah, and I mean, as you've noted, Anna, I've been fortunate enough to have a broad background in education, and as well as working in a range of schools and states and territories. I've also worked with other kind of curriculum authorities as well in supporting them to be able to either develop their policies or their frameworks around curriculum. And look, I think it's the very basic question we ask all of ourselves always. It doesn't matter whether we're walking into an early childhood classroom or we're walking into a higher education setting where we've got our first year graduates or are just about to kind of leave its graduating students, is we have to know our students. Yes. And we have to also know and understand our school context. We need to be mindful of both the supports and resources. I think we could all sit there and say, I wish, I would like, but the notion of a school that's got 2 or 3 teachers to a school that has got 2,000 with a whole sort of curriculum department in its own right. They're very, very different experiences. And for people who've been teachers in a range of environments, you'll understand you learn different things in different places.
And you've got to sort of get your boots in the ground and start running with it, don't you, really? That's quite important. I know myself, having worked, say, some of those regional kind of remote communities in the Northern Territory, what lesson I might have delivered sort of in leafy green areas, and then how to adapt it. You're sort of thinking on your feet, and you just have to go. And, as you said, really get that relationship with the students. Now, I really enjoyed reading your paper, Enacting the Australian Curriculum, Primary and Secondary Teachers, because there were some really key points that resonated with me. Now, I think, as educators, we're encouraged to develop these connections between subject areas, which can be very specific. And then we're also told we have to develop this 21st century learning approach because that's the future of what we need to teach. But often the constraints and boxes lead to very different approaches being adopted for different learning areas. We've kind of got the explicit teaching of phonics, but then we've got the creativity of writing your own story and moving into that space. We've got maths, which, because of abstract concepts, may have explicit. And then in my own field of science, what I always find quite ironic is you've got this inquiry strand, but actually that's a different type of inquiry to inquiry teaching and learning. So it's quite different in that sense. With this, though, are we in danger of losing that kind of bigger picture? How do we approach that interdisciplinary approach when there's so many opinions of different areas?
Yes, I think that's a really great question, and I would have to say over the last sort of 18 months or so, I've been a little bit kind of alarmed about some of the things that I've had spoken to me anecdotally when I've been in schools in under various sort of roles. People saying things like, "Oh no, we don't do an inquiry anymore." And something like that sticks in my head, and I go away and I go, now what is driving that kind of response, which really means they're talking about narrowing the curriculum. And when I think of Australia's curriculum, I think we're the beneficiaries of a very rich and inviting and ambitious curriculum, but it also, from the standpoint of, we don't do inquiry here, to what the Australian curriculum encompasses, I think it also speaks to some of the challenges that people might have in terms of, thinking about what is fit for purpose for today.
Yeah,
but also what are the purposes of education? And I mean, it doesn't really matter in terms of which context or setting. I think that we're actually, as I say in the article, we're talking about concepts that really, date back to Julianne and the 1930s, which is really about a comprehensive conceptualization of students' learning. And of course, what that means is students' learning and teaching and pedagogy and assessment. And so when we look at classrooms or schools or systems where we see, we'll use the word integrated curriculum being enacted, you actually can unpack the layers that actually go into that process. And, I have seen teachers in both small schools and very large schools create robust inquiry and integrated curriculum. But of course, they're doing with some of the important principles in mind. But and as it was shown in the case study in that paper, schools do it differently. Of course they do, because they're different. They're different contexts. They're different settings. But because it's complicated and messy, I don't think it means that we shouldn't keep at it. And of course, we know, as with so many sort of aspects around schooling and curriculum provision, is whole school approaches are those that actually bring the rigor, the consistency. That goes without saying. But every school, a bit like communities and lives, they're all works in progress.
Yes. And I think that's the joy of being in our profession, is our ability to problem solve, work around it and think like that and kind of take on new challenges. And I always big advocate for that for all of our teaching colleagues, because we do that sometimes 100 times in an hour. We've had to change, we've had to throw something, something's come in. I think we're very good naturally problem solvers. And sometimes I find having to explicitly teach problem solving is often a bit of a tricky one, because we're demonstrating it all the time. Now, you did cite the incredible Lynn Yates, who we have just announced this morning is coming to be our keynote speaker at our conference. So we're very excited. And it struck me indeed that the multiple, I think we just briefly touched on that, multiple integrated approaches can often lead to what she says as messiness. in that
Yes.
conceptualization and the
Yep.
implementation of this multi-dimensional model that we're trying to all bring in together.
Yep.
Now,
Yep.
I particularly loved your explanatory table in your work because it really highlighted the
Yep.
definitions of the
Yes.
approaches, because
Mm.
they are so often used interchangeably. You know, I
Yes.
look at just PBL,
Mm.
problem-based learning, but in another
Yep.
school, it's
Yep.
project-based learning.
Yep.
And, you know, I
Yep.
remember my first interview over here when someone asked me what I thought of explicit teaching. And coming
Teaching.
from the UK, I kind of
It,
thought, well, isn't that just what you do when you need to? It wasn't
yeah.
actually a concept. So
Yeah.
now you do focus a lot on teacher training, and I can only imagine for a graduate coming out what you've learned in your
Yeah.
theory, and then
Yeah.
you go to school.
Yeah.
It's so overwhelming in that
Yes.
sense.
Yes.
Is there a better way, or a way that we can support our graduates or get them prepared for what they're going to face?
Well, I mean, again, it's sort of, one of the sort of key messages that we share with our graduates is,
Mm.
like with your students, get to know your context, get to know your school. Your first year of teaching, optimistically, is just the beginning of a long career.
Yes.
Um, and inside every school, there is a nuance, there is a
Mm.
turn, and curriculum work has histories in
Yeah.
schools. And some people might well be signing up to a school which has an international baccalaureate
Yeah.
approach to curriculum. Others might be using the more global term of inquiry learning, or in a secondary school, it might be years 8 and 9, and they're talking about problem-based learning. So
Yes.
when my colleagues and I, when we wrote this sort of paper, we really wanted to kind of tease out some of those things, to be able to actually to help people to be able to do their own sort of curriculum audit, in a sense,
Yeah.
when you're going into a context. So you see which ways the emphasis, or what gets done, or what doesn't get done. So just as a way in to be able to understanding the breadth of integrated curriculum approaches.
Yes.
It's certainly not one.
No. And that's one of those things. It's the luxury of having that ability to go and find research and evidence and look at it, which, in general, as a new graduate, you just don't have that time, do you? You finish and you're straight in there. And it might not sit well with you, or you might not understand it. And that's where, as you mentioned before, the schools that have that luxury of curriculum teams are worth their weight in gold, because they can take on some of that load. Now, with the reference to your paper, it's about the amount of content in the curriculum, and we've briefly talked about this, because how you approach that. And over time, we do see a greater content component, because we learn new things, we add things in, and we have to really, as you say, like, audit what was there. But what we have done then often is narrowed the approach to teaching, because we're trying to fit it all in. And we're trying to do it the most efficiently and most quickly. Now, how does a teacher approach that curriculum and try to cover all the bases they want, but also try and learn out the needs of the learner, and also find their groove, find out what approach works for me? Like, how am I most effective? Is there a magic approach? Is there one size fits all?
Look, my belief about teaching and learning and sort of deep and rich pedagogy is that it is a collaborative practice, and being mindful that if I'm in a 3-teacher school, my collaborators, while they might be, just me and two others in a very small context, we are part of an amazing profession, and the importance of being able, no matter where you are, about keeping connected professionally, having sort of mentors, relationships that that you can start building your understanding from in a professionally robust way. I mean, some people have got years of experience that with you. Others, might have been teaching for 1 or 2 years, and they can give you some sense of what works, what doesn't work. On what basis am I actually making a judgment about their evidence? And I mean, the Australian curriculum as a model, and we're all very aware that in different sort of states and territories, of course, it gets interpreted differently, and you really need to understand both your system's expectations. And if you're a primary teacher or a secondary teacher or an early childhood teacher, you already know that there are particular sorts of framings that are going to be important for you. But I guess that one of the things that I always enjoyed when I was a teacher in a classroom, again, no matter what the size of a school, is that taking up the role of a teacher leader, and you don't have to have the hat, curriculum coordinator, but to go and connect with other schools, other communities, set up your own inquiries. People talk about teacher research, action research, there are all sorts of labels and names, but really I like the term professional inquiry, because it's us that we need to be able to say to ourselves, so what is the question? What is the question that we have? Do we want to explore it? Do we want to know more about it? Can we find an expert who is able to be able? So I think that the whole notion of problem solving and professionalism go hand in hand.
Yes. And I think you made that really great point about those kind of connections and community of practice, really, isn't it? Because I think it probably took me quite a while in my career to find out that there is external people outside of my school environment who could help me, and things like, like AXA or whatever it is, the associations that also have people behind it, who've experienced. And you were mentioning that about, experience in the classroom, and how often have we seen the teacher, as you're saying, on the way out, who's like, oh, another new program, something else that's coming in. We've seen it before, but it's actually really important for, for young teachers to sort of have that balance. Now, sort of, I mean, I started off my career in like a leafy green school in the UK, and I really didn't appreciate that the fact was that I was given so much autonomy to kind of explore practice and discover my identity as a teacher in terms of the pedagogical approaches I felt more comfortable with. But that was because much of the barriers that we see today had been taken away from me: behaviour management, resourcing, low staff numbers, high turnover of staff. So it did then mean that when I was in challenging school environments, my pedagogy and my kind of curriculum knowledge, I felt secure in. I knew what I was doing so that I could tackle all the additional things that were coming on. And that's a real luxury, I think, because a lot of our graduates are going into kind of remote areas and the pressure to be a speech therapist, an OT, or whatever it is on top of what they've learned. I suppose it is, how can we give them the confidence to tackle some of these things and challenge as well? Say, can you show me? Because I've been in many environments where I've, someone said to me, but it's evidence-based or it's data-informed. And then, when I've looked at it, it's like, that's based off 12 children in the US. Like, that's not going to work for me. But how, as a young graduate, can you do that? That's really tough, isn't it?
Yes, and there's no denying all those kind of challenges. And I guess that's the other thing that my career has given me. And really, this is where my passion came from around sort of integrated curriculum, was that once we kind of moved to somewhere else, which was a negotiated sort of part of the curriculum, life often changes for some students, and they can bring to the fore their knowledge and understanding. And as we all know, but classroom behaviour, is probably about something else. And we, the teacher on the day, are kind of the person who's in that moment. And we all know about the challenges of low literacy level. And I mean, I would be the last person to say that in terms of your pedagogies, that you you work always to the progressive end, which,
Mm,
supposedly is the student directing the learning entirely. That's very rare. That's very rare. And when you look at great teachers, that's
yeah,
kind of one of their skills, is
yeah,
to be able to, interact between those two spaces. And I think the use of the word learning sciences, of course, people
yeah,
have, that has become a really prominent part
yes,
of the language that's being used in
100%.
policies, in classrooms, in, staff rooms, etc. But there's not a single learning science. There
No,
are learning science is.
definitely.
And as a teacher, it's really important to be able to know and understand which part of the learning science is I might actually need to be able to support me at this point in time. And as you said, that's both about knowing who you are, but also taking a very close look at how curriculum documents can actually help you. And
Yes.
I am always sort of delighted when I go back into our sort of resources that we have in Australia and in
Mm,
terms of what is available. But
mm,
we're time poor teachers, we know
yeah.
that. But again, I come back to the collaboration, to the working together. It's amazing what you can solve when you bring sort of a group of like-minded concerned
Mm,
people around a particular question. And I think that's one of the key things as a sort of as a teacher, as a graduate teacher, that you're able to ask yourself those questions.
mm,
Write it down, and
yes.
work out what you need to be able to start solving part of that. At times, some of it there will still be big gaps and understandings, but if you actually keep systematically sort of working towards
Mm,
addressing that question, you get a greater sense of sort of control in yourself. Your
mm,
agency, your confidence emerges as well, and that's all part of your teacher self,
yeah.
growing and changing over time. And again,
Yeah.
back to Dewey, or taking notions from our own indigenous knowledges, the
Mm,
importance of the experience of being
yes.
there, being present, being in the moment are absolutely vital. And again, one of the most satisfying things as a teacher is to be able to see what happens at the end of that
Mm,
term, at the end of the year. But again, you've got to sort of think, well, I might know this anecdotally, but what are the other sort of forms of assessment practices that I've been
yes.
using or not using? How
Yes.
can I actually put a small thing in? And my kind of comment would be on watching lots of people on beginning teaching, or those who are really expert teachers, is often some of those inverted commas interventions are very small, but they're targeted, and they're targeted to the learner, and they're
Yeah,
they're contextual, and they're culturally relevant.
definitely. Yeah, I really like that point. What you're talking about, that kind of the teacher reaching out, and I think that's a difficult one sometimes, because we don't want
Yep.
to show vulnerability, or we don't want to
Yes.
see that
Yep.
we don't know it.
Yep.
And it probably took me quite a while, because I thought I
Yep.
knew it all,
Yep. Yep.
as you do, because I've done my
Yep.
training, I did my years, and I'm
Yep.
done.
Yep.
Um,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
it really relies, as you're saying, on that collegiality and that kind of
Mm.
understanding and trusting someone else.
Yeah.
And even that fact, when you're talking about that kind of assessment, I always used to think, to graduates, like, with it, if you take that time at the beginning of the year to know your students
Yeah.
and those missionaries, you will probably know what grade or where they
Yeah.
sit or where
Yeah.
they are.
Yeah.
And all of the assessments that you do are only to kind of reinforce your gut, what you
Yes.
know about the
Yeah.
child.
Yes.
And then you can much easier kind of look at the child developing, or the
Yeah.
student getting better,
Yeah.
because you've given them that benchmark and you know what they are, and this is,
Mm.
as we keep hopping back to, it's relationships, isn't it? How we build them.
Yeah.
And I'm sort of getting to the last question about this. We focus a lot on theory and
Yeah.
behind teaching, and I love when you
Yeah.
talked about the science, because it's been a bugbear of mine for so long, that
Mm.
just because we put the science in there, it kind of
Mm.
looks as if it's robust, or
Mm.
somehow
Mm.
the word science conjures up the fact that it must
Yeah.
be right because we've done it.
Yes. Yeah.
And so we see this theory of teaching and the approaches that, will give us that magic bullet and be effective. And
Yeah.
I'm probably going to be a bit controversial here and sort of say, but how much really is it gut instinct that you go in and you kind of go, I'm a teacher. These are my these are my core skills. These are what I know what to do.
Yeah.
And, we don't give ourselves credit in teaching for what we can do and to build relationships.
Yes,
and then that's that curriculum.
And a lot of people would speak very strongly to some of those intuitive notions. And while that's sort of part, and it's cliche, but the art and the science, I still actually hold that as being fairly central to watching expert teachers work, and graduate teachers who they understand that. But it also means that sometimes you do need to seek the opinions of others. And because I've worked with numbers of children and young people who do have incredible struggles around literacy and less experience in the area of mathematics, but I think that there is a huge difference when you think about, learning and parroting, and when you're actually working with reasoning and thinking. And, in the public eye, because everybody went to school, there's still that notion that anybody can teach. And I think we absolutely underestimate the skill base that Australian teachers actually bring. And that's part of, being able to understand why do those kind of public discourses continue to circulate. And of course, we're touching a bit on sort of, social theory, educational theory, but we all know the world that we're caught up in, and the messages that governments actually want to send, to their voters, to be re-elected. And I think that bringing the conversation back, of course, to the learner, being understand, well, how are you mapping their progress, their change over time? What does that look like? And again, that doesn't need to be always complex. And standardized testing gives you one version, but there are many other sort of teacher tests, teacher made tests that can equally support you, and in terms of identifying and help you enable that child, no matter where they are within the Australian curriculum, to be able to fulfill their role as a valued and a successful learner. And notions of inclusivity, cultural acceptance, and change, they require us to be humble as well, and say, well,
show that we're
maybe I didn't have it right. Maybe that actually wasn't the kind of the pitch or that sequence of learning. Perhaps this is what I need to change when we reach teachers again. But that's the wonderful thing about experience in teaching, and how you are able to sort of bring that right home to you. And I think that's one of the joys of being a teaching professional, is you grow and change over time. No one would ever kind of at the end of their teaching career often sort of anticipate where that career has taken them and what they have learnt over time. But I come back to over and over again when I listen to expert teachers, they will talk about others who have supported them, collaborated, freely kind of given them knowledge. But to be able to access that, you have to be able to ask the question of yourself.
Definitely. And even that, when you're talking about that assessment piece, as well, like there's often a time where you just don't know. And your colleague next door, they will always be willing to go, what, I'll have a look and see what I would come across. And we talk about kind of going through this process when we do tests and co-marking, but you really need to just open it up and say, I'm just not sure on this. This isn't what I've got.
Yes. Yes.
Come and have a look in.
Yes.
And I think if it was, sometimes I just think, and I made that mistake at the beginning when you start, you really think that every minute of your day needs to be filled with imparting wisdom to these to children. Yeah. And I think as you get older and you kind of more experienced, you have to put your life jacket on and say, you know what, I can't do that all day. No. But if I read a story and we bring it all down a bit, then actually there's still a huge amount of learning going on. That's just right. Because I'm not doing it rote. That's how is the book. And that is a huge part. Now, I always like this last question because it really challenges people. But I suppose, has there been a teacher in your life that inspired you on your journey?
Look, I think the answer to that are many. And I think that I could cite examples from still across my primary years of schooling, across my secondary year of schooling, and throughout my teacher education, people who provide you with both, I suppose, the inspiration and the desire to be able to be committed to the profession. And, we hear so much now about 5 years in the profession, and, we know, we talk about questions of attrition and retention. But all of those people who I can think of, and also some of my staff members as well, it is their kind of commitment and belief that the work that they are doing on an everyday basis does change lives. And I think that when you have that kind of sense of confidence instilled from a teacher, that is very powerful and very enabling. I grew up on the remote northwest coast of Tasmania, and so in terms of educational opportunities, people kind of would go, well, the retention rate is still not very bright in the Tasmanian context, but those teachers supported, in conjunction with our families, the notion that it was important to be able to continue and persist with education, because it does change lives. Inspirational teachers, that's what they do.
100%. And that's a beautiful way, summing up our profession. And I think that knowledge that sometimes the results aren't immediate.
Yes.
They could happen 5-6 years down the line. You see a student, you think, oh my goodness, look where they've come, and it might not have been in your class, but that doesn't mean to say that you weren't a catalyst for them going on that right trajectory. So that's beautiful. Well, Julianne, it's been the loveliest conversation today. Thank you so much about hearing your journey, but also I think for me it resonates, that passion that you have for our profession and just what you're doing to make sure that our next group are coming out knowing that they have that ability to become a really great teacher. So thank you so much. Now, to all our listeners today, what a wonderful podcast that has been. And hopefully you will go away and look at some of that work. We'll drop some of those links to Julianne's research in our comments. But thank you again, and we look forward to hearing from you soon.